Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the City of Homestead Ad-Hoc Charter Review Committee meeting to order. Today is Thursday, June 11th, 2020, and it is 5:33 p.m. Due to COVID-19, this will be a virtual Ad-Hoc Charter Review Committee meeting. The city will be accepting public comments as part of the meeting, which can be emailed to publiccomments@cityofhomestead.com. Public comments will be made part of the record and included in the minutes. Public comments have been submitted up to 48 hours prior to the Ad Hoc Charter Review Committee meeting. Those comments were limited to 300 words per comment, and the comments should have included the name and address of the person submitting the comment for the record. And it's my understanding that as of now, no comments have been submitted for this meeting. And let the record reflect that the only member absent at this point is Mr. Burke. He's on. So all members of the committee, all 7 members of the committee are now present. We have the minutes of the June 4th, 2020 meeting before us. Is there a motion to approve?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
I'd like to be recognized, please.
Yes, Mr. Craig.
I have been in the position of both recording minutes and reviewing minutes, and therefore I'd like to commend Mrs. Sewell and Ms. Chavez for the excellent job they do. They always do a fine job. However, on page 14 of the minutes, the third paragraph, second sentence.
Third paragraph?
Third paragraph, second sentence. It may have been my mistake, but I have an extra no in there. The sentence should read, you cannot serve more than 12 unbroken years. The no should be removed. Otherwise, it's a double negative.
Yeah, your comment is you cannot serve more than 12 unbroken years.
Correct. There was an extra no in there, and it would have made a double negative and would defeated what I was trying to say.
Okay. All right, so we'll remove
So just
that.
remove the word no, and I'm fine with it.
All right. Anything further, Mr. Craig?
Not for me.
All right, would you like to move the approval subject to the correction?
So moved.
I have a motion for approval. Do we have a second?
Second.
I have a second from Mr. Moss. Anything further from the committee? Oh, Mr. Burke, you just flashed up on my screen for some reason. All right. Would anyone like to be recorded as a no on this on the approval of the minutes? None appearing. The minutes are unanimously approved.
As amended.
Yes, Mr. Craig. Does someone signal? Okay. As reflected by the minutes, we had a very lengthy conversation and we're kind of all over the place, and today's agenda is solely a continuation of our conversation and clarification and hopefully resolution of where we would like to recommend to the council to go on this matter, and it's been termed term limits. That, not necessarily the case, but at least in part. In our materials, our city attorney, Matt Pearl, circulated, and he and I have been through this, we talked about it. It kind of hit the 3 different concepts that were discussed at the last meeting, where we ended up, I think at the last meeting with a pretty strong conversation of what we were calling a hard 12 limit. But with that, Mr. Pearl, would you like to open the conversation on the materials in front of us?
I went back, and to me, the threshold questions were the imposition of a hard 12-year combined limit and what resignations to break the continued chain of consecutive service would look like. We had discussed a year, we had discussed 2 years. So I went ahead and prepared 3 different conceptual theories of what this might look like depending on where the committee wants to go. And we can mix and match a little bit, but I thought it would be helpful if we just walk through each of those. So number 1 is listed as the current language. And we discussed the ambiguity of what if you have a council person who's coming up on their 12-year cap, let's say for council member at the moment, and they decide they want to run for mayor, they want to resign to break the 12 consecutive years of service. And so that was one of the chief ambiguities that we wanted to address. If you look at number 2, there's an imposition of a 12-year combined limit at the top. So it speaks to 12 consecutive years as council member, 8 consecutive years in the office of mayor, or 12 combined years for both positions. And with respect to the term limits, no person who serves the maximum amount of time shall be eligible to run for office until the second regularly scheduled election. This way, you have a hard 12. They have come up to, they want to resign. They would not be permitted to run in that next election. They would have to wait for the subsequent election. So this basically says, if you are going to serve your 12 years, there will be no resignation to beat the limit. Because any member who, if you look at B, any member who resigns or is removed prior to their completion shall be deemed to have served the entirety of their term. So once somebody is sworn into office, for the purpose of calculating your term limit, they have served the entirety of that term.
So in effect, that creates that 2-year break in service.
It does.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. This will address this is a hard 12 consecutive years. So it can in fact create the 2-year break in service. If we want to allow someone to go back, then it would be a 2-year break in service. But it effectively does with A, yes.
Right. So I guess I would say to my colleagues before you all kick off the conversation that this, in its simplest explanation is what we were calling last week the hard 12. You can serve in whatever offices and whatever combination you want, but no longer than 12 consecutive years. And the provision B, let's say 2B, takes away that concept of what I've called the midnight resignation, where you tried to create this fiction of a break in service or not meeting your full term by resigning at the last minute and jumping into that other race, whether it be for mayor or council. And I think that's where we ended the conversation last week. It had kind of evolved into 12 and out, and you pick your poison as to what combination you'd like to do it in. Who'd like to kick off the conversation?
Mayor, just a question.
Councilman Maldonado.
Thank you, Mayor. Can you guys hear me good?
Somewhat.
So did Matt go over, did you go over the third number yet, the no limit combined service?
No, not yet. We just did number 2, the hard 12. We can work our way down. I don't know. We can have the discussion either all at once or take them individually. It's entirely up to you.
I would prefer to hear Matt go on to 3 and 4 before we discuss it.
Well,
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, we want to go ahead with the conversation on the next one, or Councilman, you want to hold off until Matt goes to the rest?
Yeah, I'll hold off.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Go ahead, Matt.
So the next option, we had discussed a circumstance where somebody could resign a year ahead of the election. If you wanted to allow somebody to break their chain of service, one of the time frames that was floated was a single year. So you start with the same provisions that we have now with respect to 12 consecutive years as council member, 8 consecutive years in the office of mayor. But for the purpose of calculating years of service, each year accrues basically on the anniversary of the date of swearing in. So if you look at 3C. So for the purposes of calculating years of service, as long as somebody has resigned prior to that anniversary, that year, their last anniversary, they will have effectively broken the chain and could then run in the next election, thus creating a vacancy on the council. The remaining provisions within there closely mirror what we have now. What this does is this is the closest to what we have now, just creating a framework in which somebody can break the chain, because there is the ambiguity now in terms of calculating the consecutive years. This would define that term, and it would require a year, which was one of the timeframes that we had discussed. And this, as written, does not impose the hard 12. It's a little more flexible. And that's not to say we couldn't mix and match, but this allows the break in service. And then if you skip down to number 4, this is a variation on that where we also address how we calculate the total terms of service. If you look at 4C, 4C says that a council member or mayor who served 50% plus 1 day of their term shall be deemed to serve the entirety of the term. So in that instance, the council member would be resigning prior to the midterm elections. Assuming you're on off cycle, you're still running cycled elections. The council member could resign if they wanted to resign and run for mayor, with the caveat that we also have the timing requirements in D that we had discussed. It was the first item that we had discussed last week, where they require the notification to the clerk 30 days ahead of qualifying, so that we don't have to have a special election that doesn't result in an appointment, if we can piggyback on our existing election. So those were the 3 mechanisms that we discussed. So I think that for the purposes of our conversation, the first question I would ask everybody to consider is, do we want resignations to be permitted to break the chain of consecutive years of service? Whether we do a hard 12 or maintain the same thing that we have now, do we want resignations to be permitted to break the years of service? And then we can discuss what that looks like. And then secondly, do we want to impose that hard 12-year combined limit? So I would open it up to discussion, and then we can discuss the various permutations from there.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, that's you, Mr. Craig. Go ahead.
Yes, it is. Matt, as usual, you give us 3 excellent choices. You did your normal, very good job. I did a question on number 4. It says no cap on combined years of service. That's how it's headed. But right there it says no more than 12 years or 8 years. So it's a little confusing when it says no cap on combined service when we say there's a cap on combined service.
No, it's not combined service there, because theoretically somebody can serve 8 years without getting into the breaking the chain. somebody serves 2 terms of council member and they decide they want to run for mayor, without combining the 12 years of service at 12, as we did in number 2, someone could serve 2 terms as council member and then theoretically 8 years, depending. That's why I can't write it in terms of terms because we don't know how long the mayoral term will be ultimately, but 8 years. So they could, in theory, have 16 years total service on the council without dealing with the resignation issue.
Well, I thought A and B covered that.
But if they hit their maximum year of service. So if somebody only serves 8 years on the council and they decide to run for mayor, they haven't hit their maximum years of service. So that 2-year break doesn't attach. So that's why we can do it with the 2-year break. But first, I think, do we want to allow resignations is a threshold question, and do we want the 12-year limit? Because it may be a mixture of two of these options, depending on what the answers to those threshold questions are.
Thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to be acknowledged, please.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Here's the terminology. Can we state resignations are allowed not to exceed consecutive years? Wouldn't that put everything in a nutshell there?
I'm sorry, you broke up for a second. Can you repeat the question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I would like to entertain a conversation of the wording stating resignations allowed not to exceed the 12-year maximum, consecutive years. Would that put everything in a nutshell? Allowing resignations, but not exceed the 12 consecutive years. Allowing our
The resignation, I hear your question. I think that in my thought process, and I'm certainly of the position that the resignation was meant to defeat the 12-year cap. So if you're going to allow the resignation and still impose this, I think that the whole purpose of the resignation is to get around it. Because they would not be serving their maximum number of consecutive years.
We can't hear you, Councilman Maldonado. No.
I hear you.
I hear you.
We hear you.
No, we don't. No, we can't.
You guys hear me?
Hold on, Councilman Maldonado. You're not coming into the
Well,
chambers.
Yeah, he's in and out for me as well.
Can you hear me, Matt?
I got you now. And I lost you
What I'm
again.
trying to say is, yeah, we're having a problem because they have mics and laws on or put on, then we could hear about a hard time.
Yeah, can you try again? You were breaking up.
You guys hear me? Yeah, I don't know if they can hear. I'm having a hard time hearing all the conversations. They keep their mics on. It creates a lot of feedback in the system.
Okay, so Matt, in essence, in regards to the allowing the resignation not to exceed 12 consecutive years, wouldn't that be the purpose in the conversation, to get rid of the ambiguity there?
Yeah, and not allowing resignations to beat the 12 years is basically the first option. It's option number 2. Because it says that you're calculating your years of, the easiest way to address that resignation is the calculation of the years of service and how they accrue when you are looking at years of service for the purpose of term limits. And so what option 2 does, says, if you look at 2B, any member who resigns or is removed prior to the completion of their term is deemed to have served all of the years of the term for the purposes of applying the limit. So even if somebody were to resign under that scenario there, for the purpose of calculating their term limits, they have served the entirety. And so a break in service would be required. Once we choose a direction as to whether or not we want to allow this or not, I can play with the language a little bit, but because one, we don't know what the length of the mayoral term will be, I can't classify things as serving X number of terms. It has to be calculated on years of service. So the easiest way to address it, because we won't know until after the election what the term ends up being, is just adding years of service. So when we talk about accrual, the difference between option 2 and option 3 is option 2, once you're elected, you count every day of that term. It's from the first day you're sworn in to when you would have expired. For the purposes of term limits, you have served all of it, no matter when you leave office. Whereas option 3 allows that term of service to accrue year by year. So the consecutive years can be broken, if you choose to allow it, by a resignation a year prior. They will have not served the maximum term, the maximum permitted consecutive service.
Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Matt.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So when we put this question before us, I wanted to describe my position and the rationale behind it. We're discussing if if this body wants to allow a resignation for a particular council member or mayor to seek mayor or mayor seek council, right? So if the person decides if a council member decides after his second term that he may want to seek the office of mayor, I think that person should be allowed to resign and sit out the 1 year and try to get elected for office of mayor, whether it's 2 years or whether it's 4 years, whatever happens in the future. If that person happens, if we stay with the 2 years that we currently have, and that person wants to take the risk to try to seek that office, he's got to sit out for a year, and then he has to run for mayor. And if it's 2 years, it would have been, his 8 plus 2, and then he has to run again. So we're really putting the decision-making process on the people to keep that person in office. The only difference that could possibly occur is if we change the office of mayor from 2 to 4. Then he would have had not 12, he would have had 11 consecutive years. So my position is to allow resignation to seek higher or lower office. Thank you.
To clarify, we're not talking about prohibiting resignation or taking that off of the table It is a question of the timing of the resignation. And I think the more basic question is it our intention to provide for 12 years period, or if you serve less than the maximum, let's say as a council member, because that's going to be the most common situation, under what situation, other than what I've called the midnight resignation, under what situation do you not violate the break-in service, or even that if there's a 12-year maximum? Right. I think, from my perspective, I'd like to clear up the issue of, number one, are we going to go to a hard and fast 12 consecutive years, and are we going to allow the potential current situation where someone could come in at the last minute and resign after 11.95 years and then get a full 8 years as mayor? And it doesn't matter whether the mayor's terms are 2 or 4. So we're not prohibiting resignation. We would be creating clarity as to when that resignation would need to occur.
Okay, so can we ask the question that this body agrees not to allow the midnight resignation, the last hour? We're all in agreement with that, I assume. Should we ask the body that?
Seemingly so. But then I think the next question is whether or not you're looking toward a 12-year cap, or could someone potentially do, let's say, 18, 10 and 8 with a very short gap?
Got it.
Or, a 1 year, or even 11 years, whether you could do
Right.
11 plus 8. That I think is the issue.
Okay. So I guess another question for Matt, and we could just do simple math, is what is the maximum amount of time someone can serve? And we understand that if we decide not to choose that maximum, we would stick to 12.
Well, right now, there is no lifetime cap of years, total years of service. I think the issue we're trying to address is that there is enough, perhaps, ambiguity here or lack of clarity that someone could come in,
We can't hear you.
resign at the 11th hour after 11.99 years, and then do 8. So you almost 20 consecutive, but for a very short break in service.
Okay. I get it.
Mr. Mayor?
Go ahead. I yield back to you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Craig?
2 quick questions. One, does option number 2 address your concern about the midnight resignation?
It does. Option
My
2,
second question, sir.
pardon?
I'm pleased about that, because I'm very much in favor of a hard 12, even though I'm personally opposed to term limits. So my second question is addressed to Mr. Moss. If we are in favor of the hard 12, does option number 2 meet the concerns you had back in 2003?
Mr. Mayor, if I may. Yes, sir, it absolutely does. What I recall very vividly was that the committee back then wanted a hard 12-year cap for whatever you wanted to serve. If you wanted to serve council, mayor, council, as long as your term did not exceed 12 years without then taking a 2-year break, and then you could come back and run again for your 12 years or whatever you ended up with. But I do remember that the idea was that you could serve 2 4-year terms as council member, and then you still had 4 years left, so you could serve 2 2-year terms as mayor, or serve 4 years as mayor, and then come back and serve 2 terms as council member. As long as your service did not exceed the 12 years, and then you had to take a hard 2 years off before you could run again. That was what was intended. May not be clear, but I thought that the very end sentence of the current language tried to state that, where it said no candidate may run for either office of mayor or council member when, if elected, the person would exceed the limitations set forth in this paragraph by any length of time, taking into account the full regular term for the office set. So if you were going to run for mayor and you've already served 3 terms of council and you resigned a year, you couldn't do that, because even with a 2-year, you would exceed your 12 years.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I'm sure all members of the committee have studied the 3 examples, the 3 options, so to speak. Perhaps there's a consensus of that we may all agree on one of the options.
Well, and we'll get to that, but I think Ms. Mallory's been trying to chime in and been talked over a couple times. Let me have her chime in. Ms. Mallory?
No, sir, I'm sitting tight, I'm fine. I like the direction we're going.
Did those of you at home understand what Ms. Mallory just said? I had a hard time grasping it here.
She says she's sitting fine.
Pardon? Oh,
She
okay.
says she is sitting
Okay.
fine.
Okay.
She likes the direction we're going.
Thank you. All right, I think, Mr. Maldonado, I saw you pop up. Would you like to add to the conversation or weigh in? Can't hear you.
I still can't hear Elvis.
Oh. That, I don't work. Can't. Oh.
Yeah. It's, for those of you at home, is Mr. Maldonado still talking? We've got nothing here.
I can't hear.
How about that?
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, what I was saying earlier was that I'm a little torn on this, and just because it's really hard to define, what exactly is going to happen. There could be different scenarios here, and I really don't like to, I always kind of look at it where a scenario that could actually hurt the city or its residents in the sense of representation. When you're really, you might, and I get it, we just want to be clear, but when we make these decisions and we get very hard line on some items, we fail to realize that what are the consequences of those hard line decisions. And so I'm torn on this. I mean, when I spoke last time, I wanted at least some type of definitions. And what I wanted to see is at least, the ability to have some definition to what we are today. I understand that break of service, and it's important, it's cooling off. But at the same time, I think that's where I think we could kind of hurt some of the folks that have the ability to continue to lead. I mean, if you have someone that's doing a really good job, is being an excellent leader, that the community is continually standing behind them, not because they're manipulating the system, but because they're true, honest, hardworking elected leaders working on the benefit of the city, that we've now then capped them of years of service just because of the hard line that we've taken. And so, I'm a little torn on this. I'm okay. One of the items that I did want to see was the fact of seeing having the year resignation, giving them the opportunity, to bring somewhat of a fairness to it where, they're not holding on to that seat to the final moment, and then they decide to run for the mayor seat. You know, I wanted it to, I'm okay with the language that says, hey, you have to take at least a year off if you decide to run for the mayor's seat. That is something that I'm in favor for. Again, for the hard line 12-year limit is something that, you know, I'm having a hard time, I mean, I see the part of it, but I could also see how it works against those who want to run. I mean, what happens if all of a sudden you have a whole new council of inexperienced leaders for some reason, this scenario, and you only have one or two people that might want to run for the office of mayor, and you want that seniority person there, you know, and making this decision, do we hurt them? You know, that's kind of the concern that I have, and so I wanted to at least, you know, put that in, inject that into the conversation and see how my colleagues feel in regards to that, my colleagues. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
All right. Thank you, Councilman Maldonado.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to recognize.
Sure.
So kind of tagging along with that and what was actually said earlier. And I have been sitting back and listening to this proposed language, and it sounds as if we are working to be prohibitive. I mean, this is a public service position. This is a person who wants to serve their community. And it seems like we're coming at it as if this was a criminal that we were trying to keep out. And it just seemed kind of odd that we're going through such measures to make sure that someone cannot serve the community. And I have to say, I don't understand coming from the direction that we're coming. And it's almost like saying we know that the person that's going to do this is going to have criminal intent.
May I address that, Mr. Mayor?
Well, let me, yeah, Mr. Craig, but let me pick Mr. Burke's brain a moment. So then, Mr. Burke, are you coming from the position then that it's your feeling that someone should be able to serve the entire 12 years as a council member and then run for mayor and potentially serve 8 consecutive years as mayor and hold office for 20 years at one time?
Yes, I believe that if the community doesn't want that person in that position, they're not going to elect.
Well, and Mr. Craig's next, but let me just interject. As an outsider, I kind of agree with you, but having been faced with the power of the incumbency more times than my family wants to count, that's where I see the tipping point and the balance. You get stuck with incumbents just by virtue of their sheer fundraising ability and name recognition. It's a rare moment when an incumbent, no matter how bad they are, loses an election. So with that, I think, Mr. Craig, you were up next.
Thank you.
And Elvis is after that.
As I respect Mr. Burke's opinion. As I've said many times, in principle, I oppose term limits. I don't think we should have any term limits. I think that's what elections are for. But since we've already established that we want term limits, then I think leaving for 2 years is desirable. I don't think we're denying anybody to serve, Mr. Burke. We're just saying they can serve for 12 years and take 2 years off and serve for another 12 years. I think if we're going to have term limits, that's reasonable.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. All right, Councilman Maldonado.
Yeah, so I put this. Let me circle back. Let me make sure I word it right, and I'll come back to it. So I'm going to hold off for a second.
Okay. Any other comments?
Mr. Mayor, may I give a little historic
Mr. Moss,
perspective?
sure.
One of the concerns that we discussed back when we did was the fact that there were certain council members who had served for 30 years or so who basically, it wasn't that they were necessarily doing a fantastic job, because, I mean, comments that were made were basically a lot of times on issues were somewhat flippant. But as the mayor says, getting an incumbent out is extremely, extremely difficult. Even with the low percentage of rating of Congress, U.S. Congress is a perfect example. You end up getting 75 to 90% of the incumbents reelected, while their approval rating is at 10%, 15%, maybe max. So being reelected as an incumbent, and I've seen that in this town for many, many, many years, is much easier than coming up as a challenger to go up against that individual, which is why one of the main reasons we decided to try to install the term limits in the first place. That's just a little bit of history.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Moss. Yeah, and it's important to remember that up until that point, there were no term limits whatsoever. Councilman Maldonado.
So, you know, I think first of all, we're at a different time from maybe when that last conversation happened. I think today, with social media and ability to really see the progress of the work of council, I think it's a little bit different. And I even point to this last election, and I agree and I disagree with the whole incumbency. I mean, look, I think that, you know, let's look at the last mayoral race. I believe that you were out fundraised in this election, and yet you won the election. You beat someone that was just a past mayor. You could almost call that an incumbency. And, you know, he was able to raise significantly more money, that would be the discussion that we're having, right? Like you're saying that, the incumbency allows you to have the access to more money, which that actually happened in this past election that you were in. And, you know, you were not the incumbent, you were the challenger to the incumbent, even though you had the experience. And here you are sitting mayor. And so, you know, that process of the democracy, allowed you to be the mayor who you are today. And so I think that, you know, with today, with everything that's going on, being visible, knowing you're like the leaders even more today than before through social media and interactive, that, you know, I'd like to always leave it in the hands of the people. And so I'm not, like I said, I'm a little hesitant and uncomfortable with trying to put these restrictions. Again, going back to, I wanted to see some type of language that at least would give us a sense of direction. Again, if we wanted to sit out the year before, you know, some kind of guidance, but, you know, limiting, you know, if the person is a good elected leader and you know, they want to continue serving the community, you know, that term limit, you know, really hurts that opportunity. You know, we take that opportunity out of the hands of the voters and leave it, we take the opportunity out of the hands of the voters. And so I think that if we're saying that we like to leave it into the hands of the voters and the democracy, then I think that we shouldn't really be restrictive in our decision as a whole. And so, I'm okay with the language where, you know, and maybe a hybrid of it, or maybe let's say someone has served 8 years on council and wanted to run for mayor, if there's some time on hand that he could continue to run, then I think that should be allowed. I don't know what council member is there now that's probably served 2 terms and could decide to run, this coming up election against to run for the mayor. And if we make the hardline decision on term limits, then we essentially take that person that could have the opportunity to serve as mayor or get the chance to run, we take that out of the hands of the voters.
It's me again.
Mr. Burke.
So looking at the term limit situation, as Mr. Craig said, term limits are in the charter, they'll stay in the charter. What I'm looking at is the amount of time that we have just spent going midway through the second meeting, trying to make sure that we close a loophole that someone can't go from one public service position to another one. And I don't mean to sound condescending, but this is Homestead. It's not Dade County. It's not the state of Florida. This is Homestead. The amount of time that we've spent on trying to tweak the language for something that, I'm sorry, but it's just not that big of a deal. If someone served honorably for 12 years and they want to run for mayor, let them. To me, they're saying, okay, I want to continue to serve this community.
Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Mr. Craig?
Well, again, I completely agree with Mr. Burke, but what I should say is apparently as Mr. Maldonado pointed out, the voters voted to have term limits back on the charter review in 2003. So it appears to me that the voters and the residents and citizens of Homestead seem to embrace the idea of term limits. I personally would like to see on the ballot that we do away with term limits. And that is basically what Mr. Burke is saying. I would love to see that. But if we are following the will of the people, and the will of the people said we want term limits, then I think we should make it very clear that the term limits should be, as in the charter, 12 years with a 2-year break. It's either or. We have no term limits, or make it very clear what the term limits are.
And
Thank you, Mr. Craig.
I'm sorry to keep battering back and forth, but that's not what we're stuck on. We're stuck on the midnight resignation. And to me, it seems like we're approaching this from whoever is going to do this must have bad intent. And that's what I don't understand. If the term limits are there, I get that. That's fine. But we're hung up on tweaking language on the midnight resignation.
Thank you, Mr. Craig. Mr. Guzman, did you want to
Mayor.
weigh in? Go ahead, Councilman Maldonado.
Yeah, so I agree with Mr. Burke exactly. I mean, again, when I brought up the question of the ambiguity, it was only the fact that out of all of this, the one thing I did want to bring up was because that was the challenge that we had was that, you know, because from my understanding, if we wanted to, if I served 10 years on city as a council member and I wanted to run, or if I was at 11 years and I wanted to run for the mayor's seat, you know, it wasn't, you know, defined. So, and putting the year, you know, was at least the fairness that I wanted to interject or put in to define so that at least that we take away, you know, the incumbency or being elected official, sitting on the dais and then asking for money. If we move, and I chimed in on that because now I'm in that position, right? I'm no longer an elected leader and I'm running for a county commission position. And I can tell you that that benefit does not, you know, I'm not an elected leader. So people are actually like, you know, you're a regular person trying to run. And so because I'm experiencing that that's really how it works, you know, I'm okay with if we put the year of resignation in order to run for mayor, and then that's it. So that's really the only language that I wanted to get in there. And I agree with Mr. Burke that, you know, we're really trying to, you know, pretty much lock this down, which I'm not too much in favor of. Because again, you know, we don't know the scenario that we're going to have, and the ability for someone to be able to continue to lead and be a leader in the community. And again, if they're getting voted in, you know, because they've been a good leader, then we should give them the opportunity. If they're not a good leader, as we've just seen, they're not going to win. I mean, and I think the proof is in the pudding, you know, seeing maybe laws up there. That's why I say that.
Thank you, Councilman, and I'll just
All right,
throw
so
this
that's it
out
for me.
there. Winning an election does not denote being a good leader. Those are mutually exclusive terms. Councilman Guzman?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I go back to the point that if a person wants to seek a higher office and we define what that resignation term looks like, and if they did 50 plus 1% of their second term and they decide to seek a higher office, they have to sit out for a year. And I think that eliminates, I guess, echoing what Councilman Maldonado said, the incumbent privilege. So I do want to make something clear, or I want something clarified. If a person were to do that scenario and go from council member to mayor, and he is allowed to fulfill that full term if he gets elected, is the way that reads, they have the ability then to resign again and step down to council and then do another 12 years. So maybe
Yes.
so maybe we ought to cap that right there, if possible.
Well, it's interesting, and I don't recall, maybe Mr. Moss does. At some point in the 2002 committee, we talked about a lifetime cap of service. And I think it failed at the committee, that it never went to council. You know, right now, I think under the scenario that we have in the charter now, without this discussion, you're exactly right. Someone could do 20 consecutive years, council member, mayor, and then come back and run for council. And, you know, God bless them if they want to go through that many elections for the majority of their life. Yes, they have the opportunity to do that. And that was really, there were no term limits in place. And there was more than one living politician at that time that were the poster children for term limits. So, you know, this is what we came up with at that point. 12 on council, 8 for mayor, and prior service of anyone serving at that time didn't count. That was the only way that was going to be, you know, adopted.
So why couldn't we only allow the escalation, not desensitization, not coming down? For example, only council to mayor, not mayor to council, as an option. I mean, we can do whatever we want, you know? We can do whatever we want as long as everybody agrees.
I think it's probably more straight, just thinking off the top of my head, probably more straightforward if it is a consecutive cap, whether it be 12, 14, 16, whatever it may be.
So we could also consider 2 terms, 8 for council, and 2 terms which could possibly be 4 or 8 for mayor.
Well, that's right, but remember, at our first meeting here, I threw out for discussion whether or not we wanted to consider reducing council term limits from 12 to 8, and that was not met with much reception at all.
No, but that's only for the person whose desire is to resign to run for mayor. Get that?
No. We talked about whether or not, in light of the changing population of the city and what it took to run for office, and in light of the power of the incumbency, did we want to put council limits on par with mayoral limits? That was the question that I posed, and that discussion was.
But how does that question, what does that have to do with the question we have here?
Well, it was something you said that kind of triggered me into.
Oh, you're saying if when I said if only only council to mayor, not mayor to council, so that we can put a cap on the maximum amount of service any given person can can serve. So for example, if a person after 2 terms of council decided to become mayor, and let's say your 4-year term passes,
No, either way.
either way, then they have the ability to fulfill that full term. And then that's it. Then they cannot decide, let me resign again and come back to council for another 12.
True.
That's what I'm
Yeah, no,
trying
I
to
agree.
implement.
That's kind of a whole other issue, but it would limit that stringing together of service that is permitted under the charter as it is written now. So that would obviate the excess of 20 years if we did nothing else. But it doesn't. I get there's been questions and ambiguity, and the reason this is before us is to ask whether or not we want to address that.
So then let's ask the hard questions to
Well,
this committee.
I guess the best way to do that is someone move an option and let's have a discussion and a vote on that option. Mr. Moss?
Mr. Mayor, just real quick, if we were going to have term limits, which we had discussed at 12 years, and we're going to allow this resignation in year 11 and then be able to run for a couple terms of mayor or whatever, then we really don't have 12-year term limits, in my opinion. I mean, you're talking maybe 15-year term limits, or
You're right.
possibly 18 or 20 years, or then we may as well just get rid of the term limits at all.
Well, and that's-
the whole idea was we never put a cap on it. We never said, look, you can't run. We just said step away for 2 years. Go back and live under whatever it is that you pass, those laws that you pass, and then you can come back and you can run for another 12 years if you want to. I mean, that was the whole idea between
the
this.
step away, I think, is the underlying
Right,
issue.
to step away for 2 years and then come back and you can run again. If we don't want to do that, then let's get rid of term limits altogether and just let them run as many times as they want. Which Mr. Craig, I totally understand you and don't disagree with you. It's just that as a result of what was happening with more than one city council member that was reelected every single time for 30-some years, and maybe they were the best politician ever. I don't know. Everybody has their own opinions. But that's what we were trying to avoid at that point in time.
And
So
I think
either
that's a
we-
very succinct, bringing us back home. It was the idea of step away, and I guess we're focusing on tweaking the ability to play around with what step away means. Creating a meaningful step away that is an option to a clear 2-year stepping away. Does someone want to move one of the options, and we'll discuss that and have an.
I'd like to move option 2.
Option 2. We have a motion to adopt option 2, the imposition of a limit of 12 consecutive years of combined council and mayoral service. Do we have a second
it.
on option 2?
Mr. Craig seconds.
Seconded by Mr. Craig. Do we have any further discussion on option 2?
I'd like to have some discussion to make sure that we're 100% clear on option 2, and I'd like Matt to chime into any questions and concerns that anyone has. If I pulled up the option 2 here, and imposition of the limit of 12 consecutive years of combined council and mayoral service. Help me on this, beginning with the years of service, term served, commencing, you have a blank here. Is that a year that we would want to put in there?
It would be a year. I didn't know if the will would be to impose that on current council members, as the mayor alluded to earlier. I think previously, when these limits were put in place, certain years of service did not count towards the total. So that was, once we got to the end of this, that was the next threshold question, which is part of the transition. do you want current council members' service and how much of that service to count towards this new 12-year cap when it wasn't imposed on them previously? So that's another point. Once we decide, one, do we want the 12-year cap? And two, are we comfortable setting this up in a way that really does not allow any member to defeat that cap through resignation, which is what option number 2 does.
Mr. Mayor, I thought that what we were trying to do is clarify the language that already existed, and I thought for certain that we had a 12-year cap. So if we're going to go back and say, okay, anybody who's already on the council, they're not subject to that cap, then we're not really clarifying it. We're saying what we had didn't really exist,
Right.
and now we're starting something new.
Right.
It's because of some ambiguity in the language, not that the cap wasn't already there.
And I agree, and it would be my suggestion that the effective date would be with those terms commencing in '03. Beyond that, you are creating a special class of people of six office holders who will have rights that no one else would ever have. But if you take it back to '03, you're recognizing that everyone gets treated equally, and you're recognizing that perhaps there was some ambiguity there.
Mr. Mayor, if I can,
Yes, sure.
I just want to address Mr. Moss's point, because I do think that there is perhaps a disagreement or a misunderstanding about what is currently in place. What's in place requires a 2-year break of service with 12 years of counsel. If you've served your maximum 12 years, let's set the resignation question aside, but you served your maximum 12 years, you have your 2-year break in service, and then you can serve 8 years. But what if you had a council member who served just 2 terms of council for 8 years and then was on cycle and ran for mayor? They would not have served their maximum, and then they could run for 8 years of mayor with a total of 16, and that 12-year total cap is not imposed as it's written today. That's why I want to make sure that is what we want. Even if that was the intent back then, and I certainly, take your word for it, having not been there in 2003, I'm not sure that intent was fully captured in what's written now, which is why I was trying to capture it with the 12-year consecutive service combined line in option number 2.
Well, but my concern is, and again, we've been pretty good at applying real-life examples here. If this were effective going forward, it could potentially allow, if you drew the line at the effective date, it could allow Mr. Roth to serve 16 years. At the end of his next term or whatever, allow him to serve 16. It could allow the vice mayor to serve 20. And it could, and I guess potentially it would default to Ms. Bailey and Mr. Fletcher to 12, and in whatever combination they would want to do that. And of course, Mr. Shelley, if he chose to run at the end of this term, he could potentially have 20 as well. It could potentially, if without the break and service issues, Mr. Maldonado could potentially have 19.
So, Matt, question. Right now, if we took this decision, it would definitely affect everyone on that council right now. Am I correct?
Well, I left that blank so that the committee could have that discussion in terms of, whether it wanted to impose what would be practically a new cap on total combined service before the break was required. If they wanted to, just impose that across the board, or if they wanted to allow certain years of service, as may have been done in 2003, to not count towards the tab and say, commencing with, elections in 12, 14, 16, pick your election, to see if they wanted to not impose that on somebody who had already been serving under the other auspices, really practically taking all resignations to one aside, 16 consecutive years of doing 8 and H, because at that time that person wouldn't have served their maximum service.
Well, Matt, could we do this? If this option goes forward and is adopted, we could leave the effective date open and come back at our next meeting and look at the impacts on sitting members given
Sure.
different effective dates.
Of course.
I just so you all know, if the motion that's on the floor passes, it would be with the caveat that we would come back and further analyze and decide an effective date. And again, I think it's probably good to have a real life situation chart in front of us as to who would benefit and who would it burden among those who now hold office. So is there any further discussion on the motion to adopt the concept of option 2? If there's none, I'm going to ask the clerk to do a specific roll call voice vote on this one.
Mr. Burke?
Mr. Burke? Yes.
Mr. Craig? Mr. Craig?
Mrs. Sewell, are you calling my name?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Mr. Guzman? Miss Mallory?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Maldonado?
No.
What did he say? What was your vote, sir?
No.
Mr. Moss?
Yes.
Mr. Booker? Mr. Booker?
I'm sorry. Yes.
The motion carries.
Motion carries 5-2. Is that correct? I didn't catch Mr. Burke's vote.
6-1.
6-1. Okay. Very good. Wow, we've almost used our allotted time. So with that, we'll come back and Mr. Pearl and I will sit down and we'll do some charts as to, again, as I said, the benefits and burdens of the various effective dates of this provision. Beyond that, we're probably in the interest of time. We need to start again coming back and having the actual charter language drafted. So in that regard, if we want to get back on the Monday schedule, it will give our attorneys some additional time to map these issues out and begin some of the drafting that we're going to need to get before council. So the second Monday from now would be 22nd. Monday, June 22nd, here at 5:30. Is everyone clear?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Yes, sir.
Question.
Yes.
I recall that I had asked in regards for the discussion in regards to the change of the term limits or the election years from off-year elections to on. Are we going to have that at all be brought up, or is that a discussion that we need to have another time?
I don't know if it will, just by nature of the major transitional issues. Mr. Craig has requested that we talk about a transition at some point into true single-member districts. And I don't know, maybe you came in a couple minutes late last week, Mr. Craig and I. We had the conversation that it is my intention to have this committee continue to function even after we get these items on the ballot, to bring a second round of issues to council that we were not able to address due to the weeks that we did not meet. Now, those are two if you thought today was complex, those two issues in and among themselves are very significant and complex. I do want to address those and a couple of others I have. We can be a continuing committee.
Okay,
All right,
thank
very
you.
good. All right, so with that, do we have a motion to adjourn? Moved and seconded. Thank you all. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, sir.
Good night, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, good night.
Stay safe.
You too.
Thanks for using WebEx. Visit our website at